The thing about salmon that I really want to be sort of the take-home point here is that they are extremely diverse behaviorally and genetically, and because they have such a complex life history, there are many impacts, very complicated impacts of climate on salmon. But they are also opportunists. They evolved over millions of years in a climatically dynamic environment. They have a lot of natural resilience, and they, so I see our job as identifying what are the risk factors that are up and coming with climate and try to identify what is their natural potential for resilience, and then how can we facilitate that through management actions. So there's a strong motive for conserving salmon. They're economically very valuable. They're stunningly beautiful, and they're very strong. So it's definitely a resource worth saving for the whole region. All salmon spend some time in freshwater. They lay eggs and spend some amount of juvenile rearing in freshwater. That's highly variable across species and even within a species, between populations, how much time they spend there. Some of them spend their whole lives there. Sometimes that's a decision that they make on the spot, so to speak. They then, those of them that do migrate through these migration corridors, and then they go out to sea where they have do most of their growing. It's what makes them such a valuable fisheries resource. They bring all of these enormous marine resources back into freshwater, and they become valuable resource for forests, et cetera. But this complicated life cycle puts them into direct conflict with many human interests. And so there's a lot of money at stake with saving salmon. A lot of the impacts that I'm going to be talking about are directly exacerbated by specific human activities. I'm going to first recap briefly some of the ocean factors that I think you heard about this morning, but just put them quickly into a salmon context, and then I will reiterate some of what Ingrid said earlier about the freshwater impacts. So the reason I want to include the ocean is because it is the largest driver of population dynamics for salmon throughout the entire region. So one of the most guaranteed impacts of climate change is rising sea surface temperatures. I apologize for the abbreviation. SST means sea surface temperatures. Sea surface temperature is a very strong correlate for many aspects of salmon growth and survival. This is a relatively simple analysis of, at least from a salmon perspective, of what their limits might be in the ocean as a function of sea surface temperature. So there are complicated mechanisms here I don't have time to go into and aren't even fully understood. But we do see that we only see them within particular thermal ranges at this time. So this is projecting what will happen to that thermal range with climate change projections. So this lower line here shows the historical range. So this is the Bering Sea. And this is, so they did this for a number of different species. I'm actually showing you one of the more extreme examples of what can happen, which is summer habitat for Chinook. So they historically have had a very large area, relatively speaking, to forage in. That's where they put on all that massive growth. At the 2040s, you see that contracting, and by the 2080s, you see this puny little area right here. They've lost potentially 88% of their summer habitat. Now, as I say, they're complicated mechanisms. It's not just sea surface temperature per se. This is a very active area of research, exactly what it is that controls salmon distribution and growth, and just say that a number of papers are coming out. We're doing a lot of research on this. But a summary, the problem is many different factors are correlated in the ocean. It's very hard to separate them out, but they're going to change at different rates with climate change. So in terms of projection, it actually is very important to separate them out. But we can't do it yet. At the moment, we're using the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So I'm just going to jump to the story here, which is that basically we think it's mainly a food web driven relationship, that you have sort of these good decades with nice rich food sources. This is a nice fat copepod, which is good for salmon to eat. Well, actually it's for the whole food web, works its way up the whole food web. And then you have bad years. So we use this sort of good bad regime period to model projected viability of salmon under different climate scenarios. This is the result. I'll show you the results I did, which is more of a sensitivity analysis. So this is another very active area of research, is making concrete model projections of exactly what we expect and what our uncertainty is and the different variables related to salmon survival, upwelling, and a variety of different factors. So they're within the next year, I'd say, I'm going to have some concrete model projections at the right resolution. But at the moment, we're still using, I'm doing a sensitivity analysis, basically as a % of bad years. And so that didn't look like that on my screen. A little extra drama. Okay, so what we have is salmon extinction risk. This is a population viability model, and as a function of the % of bad years. And this is just one specific population. The absolute numbers vary a lot. But what I'm showing here, so first of all, this includes a wide range of freshwater climate scenarios, and I'll show you later how the freshwater dynamics work in the model. But basically, the range here is different GCMs and different climate scenarios impact on freshwater, and the x-axis is showing the impact of the ocean conditions, basically. And so it's possible that there is some sort of threshold, some sort of essentially a tipping point, even without incorporating ocean regime shifts. This is just from a salmon perspective, that there could be some very dramatic impacts of even slightly worsening ocean conditions. So we could, it actually would not take very much of a decline in ocean conditions to see fairly dramatic increases in extinction risk, and that's because it has such a major impact on their life history. I don't have time to go into all the other ocean concerns. I'm sure you heard a lot of them this morning. There are definitely influences on predators. There's a fascinating shark aggregations off the coast of Vancouver, eating a bunch of Fraser River sockeye. There are algal impacts, not these beautiful red ones, which I used for my picture, but other less photogenic ones. They do impact the salmon juvenile survival. And of course, once you're talking about ecosystem regime shift in the ocean, all bets are off. I think we need to introduce a bunch of turtles or something. Salmon are generally more surface-oriented fish, so they aren't quite as vulnerable to some of those deep water dead zones. But where we do see hypoxia stress is in estuaries. So for example, in the Columbia River estuary, and it's particularly problematic in years with low river flow. So if you have intense upwelling and low Columbia River flows, it doesn't oxygenate that water. You do see stressful conditions. There's a very strong interaction between the risk of, or the impact of low oxygen on fish under higher temperatures. It's much more deadly under higher temperatures. So there's interactions between the freshwater conditions, the ocean changes, with changes in upwelling intensity and timing, and the temperature of fish responses. In freshwater, we typically see more of what Ingrid was talking about in terms of the disease and high temperature interaction. Now, we usually think of this in terms of either migration or pre-spawn mortality. This is another really active area of research. It actually is not particularly well quantified at the moment, but we're initiating a number of studies to get a better handle on this in the region. It hasn't traditionally been thought to be very important because we think it's not generally that hot in most of these places. However, we're actually learning that it's more frequent than we thought. So what pre-spawn mortality is the fish make it somewhere between the migration route and the spawning grounds. And well, the official definition is that they actually make it to the spawning grounds, but they don't lay eggs. Now, this could be for a variety of reasons. Naturally, if you have high densities, not all of them lay eggs. But it is greatly intensified when you have a combination of high temperatures and disease vectors. These parasites breed. They're much more abundant in warm temperatures. So the propagule pressure is higher, and salmon are inherently more vulnerable at higher temperatures. However, a really important message that I want you to take home is that they have adaptations to these responses, to these pressures. And the two biggies, the first one I'll talk about is thermal refugia. Many salmon pass through a hot area. If they can get to a nice cold water area, they often can recover. These things don't kill them right away. They really only need to survive a few more weeks to spawn in many cases. And so it's very crucial for them to have access to cold water somewhere along the migration route. So this is a natural behavioral response, and it's also something highly amenable to management. They also have evolutionary adaptations. Diseases have a very strong latitudinal gradient in humans as well. You know, the Arctic versus the tropics. Think about how many immunizations you have to get, vaccines you have to get to go to Alaska. You know, you get them all to go to the tropics. So you have a very strong decline in the diversity of MHC genes if you look across different populations. So they've adapted to that greater disease pressure under warmer situations. So this is definitely something that evolves very quickly. It evolves all the time. So I don't want people to think evolution is always super slow. It can happen quickly. It's the natural response, but they do need large population sizes to maintain that genetic variation in order to facilitate responses like this. So these are the natural resiliencies that we want to try to maintain as much as possible. So another thing that happens with high temperature is because it's such a big threat to them, they will not enter high temperature in many cases during the migration. It's simply a migration block. They'll just stop and wait. And these are upstream migrants I'm talking about. This particular example is at Lower Granite Dam on the Snake River. It's these vertical lines are Chinook counts. So one thing about Chinook is that they're highly variable in their life history. They migrate at many different times of year, and they have a whole suite of adaptations to these different life history types. So these are spring Chinook. They migrate early in the year. They shoot past. It's under cool conditions. These are fall Chinook. They come in after peak summer temperatures. And this absence here are summer Chinook. At the Snake River gets extremely hot in the summer. As soon as it hits 20 degrees about, you basically don't see any fish passing. Now, we actually had a really interesting example with this just a few weeks ago. A bunch of sockeye were coming through, they're coming up the Columbia, they're coming up the Snake, they're all doing fine, and then it just stopped. And some of the fish biologists at Lower Granite were like, where are all the sockeye? They're just not passing. And so the fish biologists were on it. They were like, what's going on? We looked at the ladder temperatures at Lower Granite. They had shot up, and it was pretty much an instantaneous response. The engineers got on it right away. They actually had plans in place to deal with this type of scenario. They were able to shunt some cool water into the ladder. Fish started to pass. You can do things like that in individual situations. The dams can be modified in some cases. But the big picture is that this blockout period is getting longer, and that is going to get harder and harder over time. So what happens is basically these high temperature, these late run Chinook, sort of summer and late run Chinook, spring, are getting hit with these high temperatures and the early falls, and that imposes selection on the population. So what we have seen over time, which means that it kills off a lot of those fish. And causes a genetic shift in the population. So what we've seen over time is that migration time in all the species that migrate before those peak temperatures are now migrating earlier than they did before. That's true for sockeye and spring summer Chinook. The late runs are migrating later. Fall Chinook are now coming in later. This is a model I did actually trying to see if we could identify whether that was more of an evolutionary response or more of a behavioral plastic response, and it certainly is both. But there's very strong evidence that thermal selection did operate on this population, and in combination with a behavioral response to low flow. In low flow years, they come in earlier also, so you have this evolutionary adaptation working together with these plastic responses to environmental conditions to drive this long-term trend. So Ingrid mentioned these snowmelt dominated basins. Another tool we have is to maintain these thermal refugia through our cold water reserves. This is the Clearwater River, which is used sometimes to cool down the pool above Lower Granite Dam in the Snake River. By actually putting thermal tags on these fish, we know the fish will use that cold water if it's available to them. Unfortunately, this is one of the regions that turned red in those figures she was showing, so this is not a permanent solution, but it certainly is the kind of thing that can be managed, needs to be handled carefully. It's more complicated than it sounds. Okay, other impacts, I will just briefly mention invasive species. There are many warm water fishes, and the whole ecosystem basically is adapted to temperature. Bass are a big recreational sport fishery. There are these huge tournaments. They make millions of dollars a year for catching these big bass. The bass are very warm water limited. They will track these temperatures and they are increasingly encroaching on salmon habitat. This is a survey of the John Day River, and these black lines are bass and the clear lines are Chinook, and you basically do see Chinook shifting back as these bass move up, and there's a very strong correlation between the percentage of invasive species and native prey. So they're competing with them for native prey, and this will certainly increase in the future. It's an example of the conflicts between parties, which makes salmon such a fun, controversial issue. Okay, Ingrid covered a lot of these, the flow impacts. She mentioned the impact of flooding on reds. I'm not going to spend much time on that. And high flows. Everybody loves this picture. Does anybody actually know? I was so excited to meet journalists. Does anybody, do you?
Yeah, I work at the Seattle Times. I know Harley.
It is so wonderful. This is the best picture. I do have to say, you know, it's always good to have some positive news. I don't think roadkill will be the primary threat to salmon. I think they're okay on that front. But that's pretty much the only one I've thought of. But still, certainly, so they had the flooding issues. In these snowmelt-dominated basins higher up, you have, she mentioned the issues with low flows. These spring Chinook in particular are especially sensitive to this because they spend a full year in the water in these streams. And if summer peak temperatures do get too high, they will leave. And the adults, spring Chinook, want to spawn in August, July, August, and September. That's when they're trying to reach their spawning grounds. That's when it is low flow time of year. So they, you do see dramatic issues in these, in occasionally extremely low years. The adults have just waited and waited and waited. Okay. Anyway, and then they just desperately try to shoot in order to get there to spawn. One other issue is that these freshets that come out in the year are, you know, basically carry these smolts downstream. Very strong correlation between the size of the freshet and juvenile survival. So that's a big concern with the loss of snowpack for these fish. The point of this slide is just to emphasize that each population is very unique and has its own set of specific issues. In some cases, temperature is much more limiting. In other cases, it's flow. It depends on the life history type. It depends on the exact location and habitat. This graph is just showing the negative correlation between summer stream temperature and juvenile survival for one set of populations, and it's related to flow for a different set of populations. So we've gone through the exercise of running these through population viability models, and it certainly does lead to different vulnerabilities under different climate change scenarios. But the cool thing about this is that there actually are things we can do at the local habitat level. So there are lots of restoration, there's millions of dollars of restoration work that's being done all of the time. And Tim Beachy has spent a lot of time identifying which specific restoration actions also have climate mitigation benefits. So what we're saying is pay attention to what the risks are for the population that you're trying to protect. And if you possibly can incorporate climate mitigation restoration actions in addition to your other priorities, in the long run, that will greatly behoove you. So running it through, this is just, you know, we've looked at specific restoration plans, and they do mitigate for climate effects to some extent. If they were focused, if they were targeting climate actions, they would be even more beneficial. This is, sorry, I forget to explain my graphs sometimes. I apologize for that. It's percent change, the number of spawners under different climate change scenarios with no active restoration in black, sort of moderate, you know, sort of partial restoration, and then the full plan. These are specific plans in the Snohomish Basin that they've already identified actions they want to take. And the point is, by 2025, you will see benefits from these restoration actions immediately, but they will be, could potentially be greatly reduced by climate impacts. So you can sort of look at it as sort of challenges for your recovery goals, but at the same time, the desperate need to do these restoration actions in order to mitigate for climate impacts. So overall, in the big picture, by the 2080s, we certainly are going to see major shifts in terms of shifting toward more warm-adapted genotypes. Now, we have lots of salmon down in California. It's not that you can't have salmon under a warm climate. They just look and act quite differently. So they will do things to avoid high summer temperatures. They'll, for example, not spend a full year in the stream in some cases. These kinds of changes can happen either within a population, and it can happen either by plastic mechanisms or by evolutionary mechanisms. You can also see population replacement. Fall chinook, for example, moving up into higher elevations that used to be spring chinook habitat, that sort of thing, if they can find suitable spawning habitat. We'll see shifts in migration and spawn timing, modified growth and behavior. And some species are particularly well adapted to warmer climates, and we're very likely to see more steelhead and rainbow trout and possibly pink salmon. So in summary, there's a diverse array of threats, but I hope that by identifying specific threats and what the natural resiliency mechanisms are, we can actually try to facilitate that natural resilience and sort of remove some of the hindrances we've put in place. The dominant responses are likely to be changes in timing, changes in the location, and potentially evolutionary adaptations. So I need to expand this slide to provide more additional resources, but one thing, if anybody really loves the primary literature, science literature, I do produce an annual literature review of climate impacts on salmon. This is peer-reviewed papers, and they're available at this website, and be happy to send you the executive summaries if you'd like. But I really do want to make the point, salmon are worth saving. They're spectacular creatures. They're high cost because they come into direct conflict with humans, but it's certainly worth the effort, so thank you.